Hello, everybody. This is my first podcast that is recorded in English. I have a very great guest, Timothy Peter Hallam, but we call at the university we call him Peter Tim. Sorry, he is my former instructor at preparation class. Welcome, teacher. How are you?
I'm very good, thank you, and honoured to be part of your first podcast in English. What can we say?
Yes. Thank, thank you for accepting my wish. Our topic is Beatles, guys. And why I decided to record this podcast? Because our teacher team some stupid theories about the Beatles, and we analyze their theories, and I learned that he's one of the biggest Beatles fan in universe. First of all, teacher, can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, you've done the first bit for me, but my name's Tim. You call me Tim for short. Everybody does, and I've loved the Beatles, as Mohammed's pointed out, since I was about 12 years old. And well, grew up in England and moved to Turkey when I was about 35. So it's been a journey. But the Beatles definitely is. I would say out of all the music that I like. I didn't tell you I do a radio program as well. Connections, folks, on Ashik Radio. Listen to it. 94.9 Saturday, 6 o'clock.
Okay, then when did you learn the extended existence of Beatles? The first time you meet Beatles?
First time, my dad was a big influence on because I love music. That's why I do a radio program. I love music overall, and I think that came from my granddad. Two granddads actually. One of my granddads did film music. He didn't do film music. He made cine films and used to put music onto cine films. And my other granddad had we'll say a very a lot of people would call it middle of the road record collection, but I liked it a lot. And both of those granddads liked the Beatles, even though they were old. They were, to me, they were old. They're about my age now. Yeah. And then my dad was a big Beatles fan. So we always had Beatles around the house, Beatles records and singles, long players. And I think I liked Wings, Paul McCartney, because he was in the charts a lot. So he was on TV, and I learned that he had been in this band called the Beatles previously. And so I think really from as far back as I can remember, I always knew about, oh, that's Paul McCartney, and he was in the Beatles. And then, as I say, these records were lying around the house. There was John Lennon was shot in 1980, unfortunately. And I remember that day. I remember my grandma, she didn't like the Beatles, and she said, "Oh my God, does that mean we've got to watch like 3 whole days about John Lennon being shot on the news?" And unfortunately, yes, we do. And that was because when he was shot, he'd been in retirement for about 5 years. So I knew of Paul McCartney, but I didn't know really a lot about John Lennon. So that was kind of a fascination for me. And about 5 years after that, so it was about 1985, there was a lot of television documentaries about John Lennon because it was celebrating 5 years. And I heard a lot of music that I thought, oh, my dad's got that. And so I'd go and look for these records. Some of them I had, some of them I hadn't got. And so it was like a jigsaw puzzle of putting together all the Beatles albums and sort of gradually getting more and more interested in them. And it started, I think a lot of Beatles fans will say the same. My first real love of them was the later stuff that they did. So the conspiracy theory stuff that we talked about in the class, the Paul is dead stuff, that was kind of a fascination because I remember my dad telling me about that. And looking at the album covers, I think we looked at those album covers in the class, didn't we? With the Sergeant Pepper, with Paul with his back of his head to the camera and Paul ? And all of that stuff, backwards lyrics. Loved that stuff. Absolutely loved it. And I think the other fascination for me was the stuff that happened after the Beatles. And that was that Paul and John in the early 1970s, after the Beatles, had this feud. So Paul recorded a song about John that was like, and then John recorded one called How Do You Sleep, which was like, obviously, because the one about John was you had to know about it. But the one that John wrote about Paul, if anybody ever checks that song out, How Do You Sleep, it's very obvious that it's about Paul. And that fascinated me a lot. It made me laugh, actually. There's a lot of comedy in it. And then I got back into the Beatles sort of earlier stuff as well. So there was, I would say it probably took a year to get all of the Beatles albums. And then I got all the Beatles, not all the Beatles X albums, because some of those are rubbish, but Ringo Starr's, I've not got all of his, but probably got most of George Harrison's, Paul McCartney's, John Lennon's. I could go on, but that was my first exposure. So I guess age about 12.
I get it. It's a really good story. It's like kind of like a movie.
Yeah, epic.
What is the difference of Beatles?
The difference of I asked you to refine this question, didn't I? The difference between the Beatles and other groups, I'll tell you what that is. I mean, first sort of rock and roll record was about 1956, and it was Bill Haley and the Comets, Rock Around the Clock. He didn't do a lot after that, but we talk about people like Chuck Berry, Buddy Holly, goodness gracious, Great Balls of Fire, that guy. Anyway, that unforgettable guy. He died last year. Yeah, him. Sorry, amnesia. My memory's going. What's his name? The pianist. Anyway, yeah. So they were in American culture. Those Elvis and people like that were really frowned on because they were challenging the status quo. They were like rebels, and they were doing, they were wiggling their hips in front of the camera and stuff like that. So American sort of, I would say, the powers that be tried to sort of cancel them in a way. Elvis got drafted into the army, went to Germany. Buddy Holly died, and Buddy Holly he was kind of he wasn't sort of as much of a rebellious character that Chuck Berry. So, but after that, in the sort of early 1960s, there was a period that I would call a very sort of dark period for a lot of popular music, because it was these, what I would call crooners, that they weren't writing their own music. They had music written for them by people that wrote music. And it was mainly very middle of the road. There was a band in England called The Shadows, which was the backing band for Cliff Richard. But they were very innovative. And a lot of people have cited those as people like Neil Young, certainly has quoted them as being a sort of influence. And they were creative because they were writing their own material. They were quite innovative. They were a guitar band, but they were very innovative with what they did. It wasn't just like, one of those surf bands where it's like, and then another song that sounds exactly the same. All the songs were different. And I guess, I mean, I can't say the Beatles were the first to do it, but the Beatles were the first band that wrote, because the Shadows were an instrumental band, but the Beatles wrote their own stuff mainly. They started off as a cover band. I mean, they played in the Cavern in Liverpool, and then they played in Hamburg. So it was really like every night for about 2 years, let's say, on and off. They were playing for like 4-8 hours. So they got very, very tight and very, very good together, worked together well. And they changed the lineups a little bit, but they were the pioneers in terms of groups that actually wrote their own music and sang their own music. That was quite revolutionary. And that's why they influenced so many people, even today, and very diverse groups of people, like not just rock music, but soul music, any kind of music would cite the Beatles as being an influence, because they made their own stuff and they eventually got their own record label, and just so many firsts. And if you look at the evolution of them when they started in 1960, they started bringing out records in 1962. In that 8 years, from 1962 to 1970, they evolved like no other group has ever evolved. I mean, the closest probably I can relate to it is David Bowie. as a solo artist that did that. But absolutely, I mean, nobody does that now. You know, you can have a group that brings an album out in 2002, and they might bring another one out in 2005, and they might sound very, very similar. But the Beatles, every single album, certainly after their fourth album, was different. I would say it evolved and developed. So the quality aspect, I mean, that's the other thing. There were really good songwriters, like not just Lennon McCartney, but George Harrison as well. And the quality is, you can't really compare it to other groups. I would say there's the Beatles and then there's other groups. I mean, other groups are great as well, and they all have their own merits, but the Beatles were something else.
Okay, then I am going to ask the other question to create a chaos. Just Queen versus Beatles, which one is better? I'm going to create a conflict.
I mean, Queen are fantastic. What I would say about Queen is a lot of people like a lot of what I would call later Queen. So stuff like Radio Gaga and I Want to Break Free and stuff like that. But if you go and get some of Queen's really early stuff, so Queen 1, Queen 2, Sheer Heart Attack, Night at the Opera, I would say up till about then, that's my favorite period of Queen. They're brilliant. They're almost like a heavy metal band. I mean, harmonies, everything like that. But, and they would tell you this as well, they wouldn't have existed probably without the Beatles, without that inspiration. So I've got to say, Queen are a very different band. And I think in terms of like popularity in Turkey, probably, I mean, my students, a lot of them love Queen, you know, probably more than Beatles. Beatles are perhaps a little bit older, and maybe they can relate to it more because of their parents, you know, and I'm a lot older than my students. So, but I would say without the Beatles, there probably would be no Queen. There probably wouldn't be Pink Floyd. There probably wouldn't be Led Zeppelin. Not quite as we know them. There was a film actually called, I think it was called Yesterday. Don't know if anybody's ever seen that, but it imagined a world without the Beatles. So this guy, I won't spoil it, but this guy basically started Googling the Beatles and the Beatles had just disappeared. So imagine what that would do, what would change. So yeah, I love Queen. I think Queen are really, you know, good fun band and a lot of people love them. Completely different to the Beatles, I would say, in some ways, but similar in others. Because, I mean, again, if you look at the model of Queen, they were singer-songwriters. They all produced their own records. So without the influence of the Beatles, a group like Queen probably couldn't have existed. So Beatles.
Thanks for accepting my podcast wish. Really, I really appreciate. Thanks. That was a great record.
A pleasure and a privilege, sir.
I hope you enjoy it.
Anytime.
Thanks for listening to us, guys. Okay. Have a nice day.